ash, bone and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books surrounding you are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right here, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
So, first things first.
You're going to introduce your dummies.
Why are you bringing that up now?
Sorry, I just know how excited you are about them.
Now you've mentioned ventriloquist dummies. We don't mention the topic till the end of the segment. You know that. I was going to talk about the Patreon thing first.
I didn't say ventriloquist. I just said dummies. Anyway, I was just trying to be encouraging. You know how I feel about them, but I know you're excited, so I was just trying to be encouraging. We can start over if you want.
No, all I wanted to say is that I've decided our Patreon thank yous will be moving to the front of the show to showcase them a bit more. We only had 2 new signups in the last month, so I'm thinking it could only help to bring in a bit more support.
We do appreciate all the support we get.
I thought if we had a regular little sub-segment, a thank you segment, it'd be nice. I'm even working on a little jingle-like thing to intro it, maybe set it to music. I don't sing, but maybe one of our listeners would like to help with that.
I'm sure we have some musically gifted listeners.
Yes. Now, just imagine this sung or set to music. This is what I have so far. Thank you to our friends who listen to the show, sharing in our travels through tales of long ago, learning, sometimes laughing, and nothing does it cost, but real friends give us money. The others can get lost.
Oh, I suppose you think that's funny. I don't. And I don't think our listeners will appreciate that sort of humor. You know, times are hard right now, and not everyone can afford to give. I don't think you really understand how it is for people out there.
Well, what does that mean?
I mean, someone who buys 5 antique ventriloquist dummies on a whim. Why should people send their hard-earned cash to someone like that and then boasts about it on the show?
I didn't. You did. You brought it up. I wasn't even going to mention it. And you just decided to be passive-aggressive because you have some sort of phobia of ventriloquist dummies.
I don't. And I don't think people necessarily want to support your creepy hobbies.
Who do you think listens to this show? They probably have creepy hobbies or interests, i.e. this show. I'm sure there's some listener out there who has antique ventriloquist dummies right up the top of his list.
But do they buy them? 5 of them?
Over time, maybe. And that would be a bond they'd feel with me and my enthusiasm. There's such a thing as vicarious enjoyment, you know.
I think you might want to re-record this. It's not going well.
Anyway, I knew you wouldn't like my little jingle, so I did write another.
Oh, God.
It's less cheeky. Thank you to our friends who listen to the show, sharing in our travels through tales of long ago, stories full of folklore, stories full of horror. If you give us money, we will like you more.
It's sad, really.
It's funny. Come on.
No, I mean, all this talk, and we haven't even mentioned those new patrons we wanted to thank.
Oh.
We haven't.
Nicola Lines and Rebecca Johnson, thank you. We really do appreciate your support.
I certainly do.
And thank you to the very kind listeners who did also leave reviews this month. I Am Cool 123909 and Mad Love 2000.
Last things last.
That's not how I meant it. Maybe I will want to re-record this. Anyway, this is episode 129, The Dark Art of Ventriloquism. I am your host, Al Ridenour, and this show, Bone and Sickle, examines the intertwining of horror and folklore in a historical context. I started the show as a way to further explore this area of intersection after writing my book, The Krampus and the Old Dark Christmas, and will have a related volume out at the start of next year. Bone and Sickle only exists thanks to the generosity of our Patreon donors who choose from a tantalizing array of monthly rewards, including shirts, mugs, dusty old things from the library shelves here, and access to monthly bonus episodes. And I'll have more on all that at the end of our show.
A wooden doll, strangely, terrifyingly human, plaything of the devil, capable of such evil that only a cage can restrain its diabolical desires.
Abracadabra, I sit on his knee. Presto, changeo, and now here's me.
But somehow he's put a man's life into that doll.
Hocus pocus, we take her to bed. Magic is real. We're dead.
Our mashup of ventriloquist horror borrowed audio from a few films, both good and bad, starting off with 1964's Devil Doll, a British film in which the living, breathing ventriloquist dummy is, as stated, stored in a cage for safety. The great Borelli, who lends his voice to the character, also happens to be an evil hypnotist, a skill which might have qualified him in our last episode. You also heard a snippet from the trailer for 1978's Magic, an intriguing trailer for a disappointingly dull film despite the presence of Anthony Hopkins as the mad ventriloquist. Barely audible in the background was also a clip from what's got to be the best horror film featuring a ventriloquist, the 1945 British anthology Dead of Night, a must-see for a brilliant wraparound story and very satisfying climax. Homage was paid to this classic film by the Devil Dolls screenwriter who gave his puppet the same name used in Dead of Night, Hugo. While I wasn't going for a comprehensive list here, for the sake of the subgenre's history, I should really mention 1929's The Great Gabbo, with Erich von Stroheim in the title role as cinema's first deranged ventriloquist. The film gets a little bogged down from time to time, but was technically groundbreaking. It's not only an early talkie, but also features certain sequences in color. There are a number of musical numbers taking place in the clubs where Gabbo performs, sequences intended to showcase the novelty of sound and the staging of one of these in particular, one featuring insanely costumed spider dancers performing on a massive spider web, provides some memorable camp. But all this film talk is just a cruel bait and switch. Or it would be if you didn't already know this isn't really a podcast about movies. Nor will regular listeners expect to endure that long, windy monologue about what makes ventriloquist dummies so very uncanny, the valley and all that. What could it be? Perhaps they remind us of ourselves, that sort of thing. No, we have some serious history to get into regarding diabolical possession, the best kind of history. So I'm guessing that some listeners have heard something about the dark roots of ventriloquism, or that it was once viewed as a kind of magic, but this has nothing to do with anything intentional, with those effigies made to speak or statues of deities outfitted with hidden speaking tubes. The early ventriloquists we'll examine did not project their voices through puppets, but were believed to speak from within their own bodies, or actually something or someone else spoke from within them, specifically from their bellies, which is where we get the word from the Latin venter, meaning belly, or more broadly insides, gut, or even womb sometimes, and the other word loqui, meaning to speak. We'll first look at some 16th and 17th century cases back when this phenomenon was viewed as a symptom of demonic possession, with one notable exception. For instance, from a 1682 publication entitled
Wonderful Prodigies of Judgment and Mercy, discovered in above 300 memorable histories, and embellished with diverse, curious pictures.
we hear of a simple peasant, John Fox, living in Nottingham, who was
possessed by a devil who would violently throw him down and take away the use of every member of his body, which was changed as black as pitch, while those fits were upon him, and then spake with an audible voice within him, which seemed sometimes to sound out of his belly, sometimes out of his throat, and sometimes out of his mouth, his lips not moving, and thus he continued for a considerable time.
and the 1664 publication
The Lord's arm stretched out in an answer of prayer, or a true relation of the wonderful deliverance of James Barrow,
Along with Barrow's case, it mentions that of
a young maid from Orpington, in the county of Kent,
who was subject to fits so terrible that it affected her
nerves, joints, and sinews, after so wonderful a manner that they had almost drawn her out of human shape.
prayers said over her, produced some relief, but the condition continues, drawing curious spectators.
From far away, all who say they have never seen anything like it. The spirits can be heard to groan inside of her belly, causing many spectators to run in fear and surprise.
A Dr. Borman, entrusted with praying over the young woman, later hears these same spirits barking like a dog, and in what seems to represent the exit of at least one of the troubling spirits, a
Substance forced its way out of her mouth in likeness of a large serpent.
and flies off to wrap itself around Borman's neck. When those standing by pull it away, it vanishes. It's not clear that a complete exorcism is ever accomplished, as a particularly fussy demon remaining behind is later heard to emit
A hideous murmuring, as if it disliked its present habitation.
While none of these 16th and 17th century cases describe a witch producing voices within herself, you do commonly find stories in which a witch sends one of these talkative demons into the belly of her victim. One such case is that of Thomas Darling, documented in a 1597 publication by Jesse B. entitled
The most wonderful and true story of a certain witch named Alice Gooderidge of Stapin Hill, who was arraigned and convicted at Derby.
or that's a short version of the paragraph-long title. Anyway, it describes the 13-year-old darling as he's
thrown into a fit and a trance, wherein a voice was heard from him, his mouth being wide open, as still it was when those voices were uttered. The voice came twice, and it made the standers-by afraid. He fell into a trance, and the former voice was heard from him, speaking very hollowly, as both those unnatural voices not uttered by himself were.
These demons, one of whom is addressed by his fellows as Brother Rodolphus, identify themselves as servants to the witch Alice Goodrich, though they also seem to have wills of their own. Toward the end of the possession, the fits intensify, and Darlene's
countenance was strangely disfigured, his mouth set wide open, and sometimes drawn awry, his face turned backward, and his arms and shoulders thrust out of joint, in which time he had one fit and trance, wherein a voice said, "Brother Rodolphus, we cannot prevail. Let us go to our mistress and torment her. I have had a draught of her blood today." Forthwith it ceased, and straightways he was in a trance again, and a small voice was heard saying, "I will stop thy mouth." At which instant he was so stopped in his throat that the company thought he had been strangled.
But the choking seems to have been a side effect of the demon's expulsion, as Darlene rises and speaks.
"Look, look! See you not the mouse that is gone out of my mouth?" and so pointed after it into the furthest part of the parlor. Then he fell into a quiet trance.
A recuperative sleep, it seems, as this marks the end of his possession. We find another case of demons sent to occupy a 16-year-old girl in the 1677 broadsheet entitled
"Wonderful News from Buckinghamshire, or a perfect relation, how a young maid hath been for 12 years and upwards possessed with the devil, and continues so to this very day in a lamentable condition."
The events described begin with a conflict between the girl's father and a woman suspected of being a witch. Soon after their argument,
the maid was taken with strange fits, and sometimes would rise up in her throat like two great bunches about the bigness of an egg. And a strange voice was frequently heard within her, speaking blasphemous words, not fit here to be repeated. And if the hearers and bystanders did reply to such voice by asking any questions that pleased him, he would answer and discourse with them, and that with a voice as different from hers as any voices I verily believe in the world, she having a smooth, clear, pleasant voice, and that being very rough, guttural, and coming as it were from the abdomen or hollow of her belly, but yet intelligible.
At some point, one of the two demons is driven out, but
one continued his possession still, and showed strange tricks before them, tossing her up and down, and when she was going, took away the use of her legs on a sudden. He will often talk to some of the family, or those that come to see her, and many times utter blasphemous, filthy words to their great trouble. Sometimes tell strange stories to move laughter. Sometimes be sullen and not speak a great while. Sometimes he jumps her up and down and draws her body into a multitude of strange postures.
when the anonymous author first joins the audience of those observing the demoniac, a large crowd of 40 or 50, he says, he makes clear that he approaches this all with skepticism, realizing that certain phenomena can be faked.
Though I am not ignorant of a certain sort of jugglers of old, called in Latin ventriloqui, Yet, as no such art or design could be imagined in this innocent creature, so of the things he declared, impossible many times for her to know, wipes off all suspicions of that kind.
That is, she couldn't possibly be doing this herself. By the way, jugglers here is used in the archaic sense, which means just any type of entertainer. As evident from the broadsheet's title, the spectacle was ongoing for 12 years and hadn't ended by the time of publication. We can imagine that the large crowds of novelty-hungry visitors to the home might also find that the suffering family deserves some sort of charity, providing a source of income that could motivate fakery of some sort. While there are no such accusations here, actually, our next case did arouse overt skepticism. In 1599, the case of Marthe Brossier raised such suspicion that the Cardinal Bishop of Paris requested that a report on her be made by the physicians of the city. This happens only after Marthe and her father have been for some time touring France, drawing audiences with a series of public exorcisms. And a consistent feature of their show was the young girl's demonic ventriloquism described by the physicians in their report.
Marthe did speak in her belly, when her mouth and her lips were shut and closed. And yet, if she had done so, should she therefore have a devil that spake within her belly? In truth, it might very well be done, because in closing or shutting the breast and stomach, there may enter some air into the artery, which may make a kind of sound or voice, not very distinct or plain to be discerned at first, and yet by long exercise may be, in a sort, perceived.
More damning was a test conducted by the bishop Charles Méron of Angers. He basically did what Father Karras does in The Exorcist. In the 1973 film, this involves Regan reacting violently to what she's been told is holy water, while in fact, as Karras later tells the young girl's mother,
it's tap water.
What's the difference?
Holy water's blessed, and that doesn't help support a case for possession.
In Brossier's case, she's presented with and reacts violently to an ordinary key wrapped in red silk, which she's told is a holy relic, a sliver of the true cross. And she reacts in the same way to a reading of a Latin passage from Virgil, which she's told is Holy Scripture. The Commission's findings in a single line:
nothing demonic, much fabricated, a little from disease.
This all ended the Brossier's activities in France, but the girl and her father managed to later take their roadshow abroad. Of course, things didn't work out so happily for Father Karras.
God damn you! Take me!
An outlier to these was the 16th century case of Elizabeth Barton, also known as the Holy Maid of Kent or the Nun of Kent. Here, as you might have guessed, the voice which spoke from within the woman was said to be of God, not the devil. A contemporaneous letter written by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, to an archdeacon comments on the case.
When she was brought thither and lay before the image of Our Lady, her face was wonderfully disfigured, her tongue hanging out and her eyes being, in a manner, plucked out and laid upon her cheeks, and so greatly disordered. Then there was a voice heard speaking within her belly, as it had been in a barrel, her lips not moving, she all that while continuing by the space of 3 hours in a trance. The voice, when it told anything of the joys of heaven, it spake so sweetly and heavenly that every man was ravished with the hearing thereof. And contrary, when it told anything of hell, it spake so horribly and terribly that it put the hearers in a great fear.
Unfortunately for Barton, her guiding spirit led her to speak out against King Henry's divorce of Catherine of Aragon and marriage to Anne Boleyn, and she ended up on the gallows in 1534. "50 years later, Reginald Scott, in his The Discovery of Witchcraft, discusses the Holy Maid of Kent, mentioning her alongside those who
spake hollow, as in the bottom of their bellies, whereby they are aptly in Latin called ventriloqui, in which sort was Elizabeth Barton, the Holy Maid of Kent."
A devout Protestant, he devoted his discovery to the debunking of witchcraft. Scott naturally took a skeptical view of Barton's supernatural gifts. Ventriloquists who posed as oracles, he believed, relied on a device known in Hebrew as an of, that is, a bottle, something accounting for the hollow, distant-sounding quality of their utterances. This may not seem to make much sense, but I'll be putting it in a bit more context, at least, later. Another skeptical Protestant, John Wagstaff, in his 1671 pamphlet, The Question of Witchcraft Debated, speculated further on this thing, the of, which he suggested could be
a bottle or trunk or some other hollow vessel, which they spake through, whereby their voices must needs be very much altered, especially if they were in a cave or room underground when they made answer to inquiries. In which way of counterfeiting, some were such excellent artists that they stood in need of no instrument to help them. In regard, they could speak with their mouths shut, and their voice would seem to come out of their bellies, as if they had been really possessed with a talking devil.
And this Hebrew context again comes up in a 1646 pamphlet entitled
Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcrafts by John Gall, preacher of the Word at Great Sawington,
in which the author writes,
the Hebrew inmates, one that carried the spirit in a bottle, a bag, a pitcher, and so kept it as a familiar, or rather, those whose belly heaved and swelled and sounded like a bottle, whence the devil spake or replied, and thus is a ventriloquist, or, if you will, the bottle-bellied witch.
As you might have guessed, these Hebrew references represent an attempt to anchor arguments about witchcraft to the Bible, the Old Testament, and in particular to the story of the Witch of Endor, which we discussed in our Ancient Necromancy episode back in 2018. Appearing in 1 Samuel 28, the story involves King Saul, concerned about the possible outcome of an upcoming battle with the Philistines, ordering his servants to
seek me a woman who hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a woman who hath a familiar spirit at Endor.
His intent is for her to conjure the spirit of Samuel, the prophet who placed him on the throne, hoping that with his otherworldly perspective he can disclose to him the future. Nothing of this necromancer's ritual is described, and though no figure is made visible to Saul, he can tell by the witch's reaction that something has appeared to her. He asks her what she has seen, and she answers,
I saw gods ascending out of the earth. And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself.
When the ghost speaks, Saul surely regrets ever even visiting Endor. Not only is Samuel angry at being disturbed, but he condemns Saul's failure to serve the Lord as a proper king and predicts,
Tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hands of the Philistines.
And that's exactly what happens. His troops and sons are all slain. Saul, sensing defeat and fearing torture by the Philistines, falls on his sword. His body is discovered by the enemy, stripped of its armor, decapitated, and taken back to be nailed on a city wall. His armor ends up as tribute in the temple of the goddess Ashtaroth. So, don't play with Ouija boards, kids. But I should get back to that mysterious of the ventriloquist bottle or whatever it is. It's definitely a matter of debate, as we'll see. And first, another quick linguistic matter to address. It's said in the text that the medium witnesses
gods ascending out of the earth.
The word for gods here is Elohim, which appears a few times in the Hebrew Bible, describing deceased ancestors as spirits classed, at least linguistically, as divine beings. This could represent a relic of pre-monotheistic ancestor worship among the Hebrews, something that survived longer among the Canaanite populations still in the land. Others have suggested that the necromantic ritual described in Endor itself might have been inspired by Canaanite practice, or that the witch herself was a Canaanite. Just a theory. Now, calling her a witch can be a bit misleading, as there's no actual point-for-point agreement with that word of the early modern period and any single category recognized in the ancient world. Even in our King James era translation, she's never called a witch, but called
a woman who hath a familiar spirit.
The Hebrew from which it comes, Ba'alat of, literally means mistress or possessor of the of, which doesn't make her a bartender. Actually, of is used for bottle, or that'd be a wineskin back in the day, but it just happens to be a homonym, meaning both that, the bottle, and designating something else, which is harder to define, something supernatural. One theory has it that this of means pit, because the word has cognates in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, and Ugaritic, apparently, all of them also meaning pit or something like that. So this medium of Endor is assumed to possess a ritual pit for summoning the dead, who, of course, live under the earth. It'd be something like the pit Circe orders Odysseus to dig in order to bring up the spirit of the prophet Tiresias in the Odyssey. But unfortunately, that's not how the word's used in Hebrew. The King James translation described this of, which is possessed, as a familiar spirit. Most other translations just describe this woman that Saul consults as a medium, which is simplest, as it's literally her function. But the translation using familiar does offer something more, because it represents a supernatural relationship with a second entity, a doubling of her being in some way. Well, the medium could just be thought of as contacting those outside, something on the other side. The use of familiar gives us something more like an internal connection, like the witch who shares her eyes with her animal familiar, the mouse she sends to spy at a neighbor's house. It's like sharing a body, so two beings in one, which does remind us of those talkative, belly-dwelling spirits. While at the time of King James, translators had contemporary witch folklore as an analog, it was the culture of ancient Greece that inspired the first translations from Hebrew, and it's here that the connection with ventriloquism was cemented. This translation of the Old Testament into Greek was produced around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, after the conquests of Alexander the Great had spread Hellenistic culture throughout the Mediterranean, making Greek the lingua franca, so to speak. As a result, Hebrew was largely forgotten among the diaspora Jews, and hence the need for this translation known as the Septuagint. It's here that the Witch of Endor becomes, in Greek,
the belly speaker of Endor.
Why? Well, because the voices that seemed to come from within the abdomen were supposedly associated in this Greek world with oracular speech, though not specifically with necromancy, at least until this translation. The Greek term engastrimithia, literally one who has words in his belly, and you can hear the word gastric in there, engastrimithia, is first used in connection with a legendary figure called Eurycles, mentioned by Aristophanes in his play The Wasps around 422 BCE, and also in Plato's The Sophist around 360. Both merely make vague references to Eurycles that tell us very little about him other than the fact that he was a belly speaker, and he became a sort of archetype or prototype so that a ventriloquist could sometimes simply be referred to as a Eurycles. It said he was some sort of Athenian diviner, but it's quite possible this identity was merely elaborated much later, say after the Septuagint translators had already associated belly talk with messages from the other side. Regardless, it's not hard to imagine that a voice seemingly issuing from within a person could suggest something otherworldly, or to recognize a kind of ventriloquism in what the medium of Endor does, that is, produce a voice from an unseen source. What's missing in all this, however, is the ability of that voice or intelligence to foretell the future. But a ready analogy was at hand, a particularly well-known figure in the ancient world through whom the gods spoke. From at least the 8th century BCE, the priestess of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, had been delivering her prophecies while seated upon a tripod chair in ecstatic trance. Located on the site where Apollo was said to have slain the monster Python, Delphi was originally called Pythia, and that is the name that was given to the oracle herself, the Pythia. The writer Plutarch served as a priest there at Delphi toward the end of his life and end of the 1st century when the oracular tradition was on a slow wane. Addressing this in his work on the obsolescence of oracles, he makes an interesting comment on a linguistic shift that had recently happened, comparing the oracle to
ventriloquists, who used to be called a Eurycles, but now a Python.
Around the same time, the author of the biblical book of Acts, writing in Greek, describes a fortune teller who follows the apostles Paul and Silas as having
the spirit of Python,
a phrase that remained in certain English translations, much to the confusion of certain Sunday school teachers, I'm sure. The first Latin translations of the Bible, appearing at the end of the 4th century, also described the medium consulted by Saul as
the Pythoness at Endor.
The oracle at Delphi was actually consulted into the Christian era, that is, until the Byzantine Roman Emperor Theodosius I ordered its destruction in 390, a full 67 years after Christianity was made the official faith of the empire. In those years, during which Christianity struggled against paganism for ascendancy, the Greek philosopher Celsus wrote a scathing diatribe against the Christians, the true word, which we actually only know through quoted fragments preserved in a rebuttal penned by the theologian Origen. I mention this as it includes references to the Pythia that are part of a larger reinterpretation of the figure, in particular an effort by Christians struggling against that pagan heritage to paint the Pythia in negative terms. Origen writes,
sitting at the mouth of the Castalian cave, the prophetess receives a spirit through her genitals. She utters the holy statutes and divine oracles. The pure mantric spirit Apollo slips from the body of the earth into the so-called prophetess through her genitals as she sits at the Pythian cave.
Now, Origen did not make this up of whole cloth. The pagan writer known as Pseudo-Longinus, already in the 1st century, in his work On the Sublime, wrote,
the account holds that the Pythia approaches the tripod, where there is, as they say, a chasm in the earth that emits an inspired vapor. And sitting in the place and being impregnated by the demonic power, she immediately chants oracles according to her inspiration.
Demonic here in the Greek sense, referring really to lesser godlike beings, not devils, actually. By the 4th century, however, the church father, John Chrysostom, was doing his best to make the Pythia sound devilish, writing in one of his homilies,
This Pythia is said to at times, with her legs spread upon the tripod of Apollo. Thus, the evil spirit rising up from below and issuing itself through her genitals, fills the woman with madness, and she, letting down her hair further, then raves like a bucket and spews foam from her mouth, and being thus in a drunken state, she utters the words of her madness.
And it even got worse by the 16th century. The French magistrate Nicolas Remy, who specialized in convicting witches, in his 1595 work, Demonolatry, commented on the Pythia, describing her as having a prophesying spirit
In her belly,
and associating the belly here with the gut and its contents, remarking,
very often the devil has his dwelling in those parts which, like the bilge of a ship, receive the filth and excrements of the body.
The 17th century German polymath Athanasius Kircher, who wrote on religion, history, geology, and medicine, and was known in his day as the
Master of 100 arts,
also had a few things to say about ventriloquism. Oddly enough, these are to be found in his 1627 work titled, in Latin, Oedipus the Egyptian. The volume serves as Kircher's explication of Egyptian hieroglyphs, though most of it's misguided. His discussion of ventriloquists, or belly speakers, makes a half-hearted attempt to connect the meaning of the Hebrew of with what he calls pythons. It's generally all ground we've covered, but he does move the locus of this activity even lower than the gut, describing ventriloquism as an especially heinous practice.
for it is the most deceitful and unclean of things to impose upon all manner of people with the most impure of actions, namely speaking from the body's private parts. This shameful and ridiculous worship of the ventriloquial spirit of the python came forth from nowhere but Egypt, among whom the foul demon often gave reply in noise emitted from the shameful, especially the posterior parts of the body.
Kircher marshals a number of early Christian writers to bolster his arguments, writing, for instance, that the first century writer Marcus Menicius Felix held that the Egyptians
dread the noises emanating from the private parts of the body.
The idea of ventriloquism as a sort of artful flatulence sent me down a rabbit hole. I found a related letter written around 170 by Theophilus, the Patriarch of Antioch, in which he rants about the religion of the ancient Egyptians.
Why should I further recount the multitude of animals worshipped by the Egyptians, both reptiles and cattle, and wild beasts and birds and river fishes, and even washpots and disgraceful noises?
Then, from the middle of the 4th century, we have a few references to the topic in literature attributed to Pseudo Clement. In one of his homilies, he also goes off on the Egyptians for their veneration of various animals, including the cat, the
serpent, yea, even of a fish, and of onions, and rumblings in the stomach, and common sewers, and members of irrational animals, and the myriads of other base abominations they gave in the name of God.
He basically repeats this sort of list in his work Recognitions, using the Latin phrase
crepitus ventris.
This could theoretically be translated a number of ways. Ventris means of the stomach, and crepitus can designate an number of sounds, different sounds, but is particularly used for a crack or pop, bang, explosion, so on. I think you see where this is going. But it probably went further than you imagine. By the 16th century, with a simple capitalization, crepitus ventris was transformed into
the god of farts.
Or at least it was mistaken as such. In the 1621 work, The Anatomy of Melancholy, Robert Burton included crepitus ventris in his list of body gods of antiquity, along with Priapus, an actual fertility god, always shown with a prominently erect member, and Cloacina, an actual goddess who presided over the sewers of Rome. Voltaire also included our pal Crepitus in his 1764 philosophical dictionary under his somewhat tongue-in-cheek entry for polytheism, enumerating what he regarded as ridiculous objects of veneration. And then, drawing on Voltaire, Gustave Flaubert, in his dramatic 1874 prose poem, The Temptation of St. Anthony, provides Crepitus with a lovely speech.
I once was honored. Libations were made to me. I was a god. The Athenian once hailed me as a favorable omen, while the pious Romans cursed me with raised fist, and the pontiff of Egypt, abstinent from beans, trembled at my voice and paled at my odor. I had my glory days. Jolly Aristophanes placed me on a stage, and the emperor, Claudius Dufus, had me sitting at his table. I made the rounds majestically in the togas of patricians. The golden vessels resounded under me like kettle drums, and when stuffed with lamprey, truffles, and pâtés, the intestine of the master noisily emptied itself. An attentive universe learned that Caesar had dined.
While Crepitus was never an actual god, Aristophanes in his play, The Clouds, does indeed liken the sound of thunder to heavenly flatulence. And now, to clear the air, so to speak, I thought we would end the show with something more wholesome, a song by the Christian musical artist Marcy Tigner, who also happened to be a ventriloquist. Tigner recorded 30 albums from 1965 to 1982, selling roughly 2 million records along the way. She also published books, had a radio program, and made some short films. Not under her own name, though, under that of her puppet, Little Marcy. The unforgettable voice given the doll was, in fact, Tigner's natural voice, which sounded for all the world like that of a 5-year-old girl. While, as a young woman, she loved singing, audience reaction discouraged this. And so she took up the trombone instead. That is, until a friend suggested that her singing voice might be better enjoyed if it came from a ventriloquist doll, and the rest is history. Our audio comes from the 1973 album Happy Am I, and in keeping with a sub-theme of our show, that of demonic possession and exorcism, I've chosen the cut Devil, Devil, Go Away. So enjoy. Sleep tight.
Inside my heart, and from me
last.
I hope everyone's been enjoying our show, and if so, that you'd leave us a review to boost our visibility. We've added a link to walk you through that process on our website. You can find it via the reviews menu, or even better, join us on Patreon as a supporter. Among the many reward tiers available, a monthly pledge of $2 provides you immediate access to posts on our show blog, in which I share curious tidbits from history, folklore, and films related to our general subject matter. Donating a mere $4 or more monthly brings you an extra episode every month, one similar to what you've just heard, but a bit shorter. I should also mention that when you access the blog and bonus episodes, it's not just the material from the current month we're talking about. There's a long archive stretching back to 2018 with content you can immediately enjoy. Other rewards include downloads of those show soundscapes heard under the narration, the show scripts, my Krampus book, various t-shirt and mug options, and unique hand-packed mystery kits. Bone and Sickle is written and produced by me, Al Reidenauer. Mrs. Carswell is played by Sarah Chavez, whose children's book, We Need to Talk About Death, can be found on Amazon and in stores near you. Thanks so much for listening.